On the 1st of May, 1945, nearly 9,000 Allied airmen woke up inside a German prison camp and found the guards gone. The watchtowers were empty, the dogs were gone. Where the swastika had hung over the main gate for 3 years, there was now a flag someone had sewn by hand out of old bed sheets and a piece of red long underwear. 6 months earlier, the man responsible for that flag had been a prisoner with nothing, no rank that meant anything behind that wire, no weapon, no way out. By the end, the same German officers who had once decided whether he ate that week were negotiating with him like he outranked them. Before this story goes any further, a quick reminder. While a lot of channels rely on unverified, fake, or exaggerated rumors, we don't play that game. We value your trust. Everything on this channel is strictly verified. Today's episode is sourced from the National World War II Museum's archival account of the liberation of Stalag Luft I and Roger Freeman's book Zemke's Stalag, written directly with the man himself. Full source list is in the description below. Now, let's go back to where this begins. Because to understand how a prisoner ends up giving orders to the men who imprisoned him, you have to go back to the day he had no orders left to give anyone. You have to go back to a spinning cockpit 4,000 feet over Germany in weather no sane pilot would have flown into. His name was Hubert Zemke. Everyone called him Hub. And on October 30th, 1944, he was not supposed to be flying combat missions at all. By the fall of 1944, Hub Zemke was already something close to a legend in the 8th Air Force, and he knew it, which made him uncomfortable in a way that people who didn't know him rarely understood. He commanded the 56th Fighter Group. Pilots called it the Wolf Pack. It would finish the war with more confirmed aerial victories than any other fighter group in the European theater. Zemke himself had nearly 20 kills of his own in 154 combat missions. He was 27 years old and already a full colonel, which in the peacetime army would have taken most men another 15 years to reach. He wasn't reckless. Pilots who flew under him will tell you that. He was, if anything, the opposite, a stickler for discipline, for formation, for doing things by the book even when the book felt slow. Some of his men resented him for it. Most of them, eventually, understood why he was still alive to give the orders. But by October of 1944, headquarters wanted Zemke behind a desk. He'd done his tour. He'd done more than his tour. The Army doesn't like losing colonels with his kind of record to enemy flak, and there was a war still to win with plenty of younger pilots who hadn't yet had the chance to prove themselves. Zemke had other ideas. The 494th Fighter Group needed a new commander, and they were converting from the P-38 Lightning to the brand new P-51 Mustang, the plane every fighter pilot in Europe wanted to fly. Zemke volunteered for the transfer. It meant one more combat tour before the desk job found him for good. October 30th was supposed to be his last mission before that transfer took effect. A routine sweep over Germany. Nothing that should have ended a career, let alone a war. The weather had other plans. Zemke flew his formation directly into a violent churning thunderhead, the kind of turbulence pilots described later as feeling like the sky itself was trying to tear the aircraft apart. His Mustang was thrown into a spin. The airframe, never designed for that kind of stress, began to come apart around him. A wing tore loose. There was no controlling what was left of the aircraft after that. Zemke bailed out over enemy territory, parachuting down into a country that spent 5 years learning to hate the sight of American airmen falling out of its sky. He landed with injuries, not fatal ones, but enough to slow him down in a situation where speed was the only thing that might save him. For several days he evaded capture. We don't have a detailed hour-by-hour account of those days. The historical record here is thinner than it is for what came after, and honest history says so plainly, rather than filling in details that were never recorded. What we do know is that his luck eventually ran out. He was captured by German forces and handed over for interrogation. And this is where the story could have gone the way so many downed airmen stories went. A name, a rank, a serial number, and then years of silence inside a barbed wire enclosure, waiting for a war to end that showed no signs of ending soon. Instead, something else happened. Something that would take 6 more months to fully reveal itself. But it started here, in the hands of the German intelligence system's most effective interrogator, a man the Allies would later study for decades. His name was Hans Scharf. If you know anything about German interrogation of Allied airmen in the Second World War, you may already know his name, because after the war, the United States Air Force invited him to lecture American interrogators on his own methods. That's not a detail added for drama. It's documented fact, and it tells you something important before we go any further. Scharf didn't get results through torture. He got them through kindness. Nearly every American and British airman shot down over German-controlled Europe passed through the same processing point, a facility near Frankfurt that the Allies referred to by its German name, Gulag Luft. Officially, it was a transit camp. Unofficially, it was Germany's central clearinghouse for extracting intelligence from Allied aircrew before they disappeared into the permanent camp system. Scharf worked there, and he had built, by 1944, a reputation among Luftwaffe intelligence as the best they had. His technique was almost disarmingly simple. He never threatened a prisoner. He rarely even asked direct questions. Instead, he'd sit an exhausted, frightened, recently captured airman down, offer him something to eat, and start talking, casually, warmly, like an old friend catching up. He already seemed to know everything: the name of the airman's commanding officer, the base he'd flown from, sometimes even the name of the squadron mascot dog. Most of what Scharf already knew he'd pieced together from months of captured documents, previous interrogations, and careful cross-referencing. Not magic, just patient intelligence work dressed up to look like magic. But to a shaken 22-year-old who just watched his aircraft break apart under him, it felt like the man across the table already had the whole picture. All that was left was small talk, confirming a detail here, correcting a minor error there. Airmen who went through it later admitted they had no idea, in the moment, how much they'd actually given away. One veteran, reflecting years afterward, put it simply: Scharf got something out of nearly everyone, even when the prisoner walked away feeling like he'd said nothing at all. Zemke was not an ordinary catch. He was a full colonel, a group commander, the kind of prisoner worth Scharf's personal attention, and by several accounts, Scharf did personally interrogate him during this period, along with other senior officers funneled through the Gulag Luft system. We know the process was slow. Accounts describe roughly 6 weeks of interrogation and transfer between different German holding facilities before Zemke's captivity settled into something more permanent. That's a long stretch of a man's life spent in rooms designed specifically to break down his sense of control, one polite conversation at a time. And somewhere in the middle of those 6 weeks, something happened that had nothing to do with interrogation technique at all, something that would follow Zemke's reputation for the rest of his life, and that neither side, German or American, fully knew what to do with. He was being moved by train between interrogation points when Allied fighters, his own side's aircraft, began strafing the train. It's a detail that sounds almost too strange to be true, and it's precisely the kind of detail we flag honestly rather than smooth over. The fullest documented version comes primarily from Zemke's own later account, corroborated by his biographer. In the chaos, with German civilians on board, including 2 young girls caught in the open, in the direct path of the strafing runs, Zemke, a prisoner, under guard, with every reason in the world to use the confusion to try to escape, went back into the line of fire to pull them to safety. He didn't run. He went back. According to that same account, German officers considered recommending him for a medal for the act, an almost unthinkable gesture toward an enemy prisoner, and one that by some accounts never actually went through, likely because giving a decoration to an American POW was more than the system could stomach, whatever the individual officers involved might have wanted. We don't know exactly what was in Zemke's mind in that moment. No source claims to. What we can say with confidence is that it was witnessed by German personnel and that it planted something in how at least some of them saw him going forward, not as a name on an interrogation file, but as a man who'd made a choice under fire that had nothing to do with saving himself. That mattered. Not immediately, not in any way that changed his circumstances in October or November of 1944, but 6 months later, when everything came down to whether the Germans guarding 9,000 men would trust the American prisoner running the other side of the wire, it mattered more than anyone involved could have predicted at the time. First, though, Zemke had to reach the camp that would define the rest of his war, and what he found there on arrival was worse than almost anything the interrogation had prepared him for. Zemke arrived at Stalag Luft 1 on December 16, 1944. The camp sat on the Baltic coast, near a small German town called Barth, roughly 100 miles northwest of Berlin. The Americans held there had a name for it, one soaked in the specific, dark humor that prisoners of war develop to survive captivity. Beautiful Barth on the Baltic. It was cold, flat, exposed to wind coming straight off the sea, and there was nothing beautiful about it at all. By the time Zemke walked through the gate, roughly 7,000 Allied airmen were already living inside the wire, some of whom had been prisoners for years. And here's what makes this engagement beat worth pausing on before we go further. This channel exists because stories like this one deserve to survive as more than a footnote. If that's why you're here too, this is the moment to hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of the war's overlooked side still to come. The conditions Zemke found were bad, and getting worse. Food was insufficient, German rations for POW camps had never been generous, and by the winter of 1944 into 1945, Germany itself was running out of nearly everything, which meant the men guarding the camp were often nearly as hungry as the men they guarded. Red Cross parcels helped when they arrived, supplementing thin German rations with tinned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, and coffee. But parcel shipments were unreliable, dependent on transport lines that Allied bombing was steadily destroying. Clothing was inadequate for a Baltic winter, medical attention was minimal, and discipline among the prisoners themselves, men who had been sitting in the same enclosed space for months or years, cold, hungry, and increasingly aware that the war might be ending without them ever getting out, had begun to fray. The German administration wasn't uniformly hostile. Some officers were simply indifferent, going through the motions of running a camp in a war they privately suspected was already lost. Others were harder men, invested in the system, unwilling to concede an inch of control to the prisoners they oversaw. Zemke walked into this as the highest-ranking Allied officer in the camp. Under the rules that governed POW camps, rules that both sides, whatever their other conduct, generally respected when it came to internal camp administration, the senior Allied officer present became the senior Allied officer, responsible for organizing and representing the prisoners as a body. It wasn't a formal military authority the Germans were required to recognize. It was closer to a negotiated status, one that depended entirely on whether the camp commandant chose to deal with him seriously or not. Zemke was suddenly responsible, in some meaningful sense, for 7,000 men. Their discipline, their morale, their survival through a winter that showed no sign of mercy in a war that showed no sign of ending soon enough. He had one advantage almost nobody else in that camp had, one his captors didn't fully appreciate until it started working against them. He spoke fluent German. Zemke's parents were German immigrants. He'd grown up hearing the language at home, and by adulthood he spoke it well enough to pass as a native in casual conversation, a detail that meant something very specific inside a camp where nearly every interaction between prisoners and guards had to pass through a language barrier most Americans simply couldn't cross. Most senior Allied officers in German POW camps dealt with their captors through interpreters, through stilted formal exchanges, through the natural friction of two sides who couldn't fully understand each other even when they wanted to. Zemke didn't have that barrier. When he sat across from a German officer, there was no translation lag, no room for the kind of misunderstanding, deliberate or accidental, that interpreters can introduce. It's worth being honest about what this did and didn't mean. Speaking German didn't make the guards Zemke's friends. It didn't erase the fact that he was a prisoner and they held the keys. What it did was give him direct access, the ability to argue, to negotiate, to push back on a bad decision in real time in the guard's own language without anything getting lost or softened in translation. He started using that access almost immediately. Camp discipline among the prisoners was one of his first priorities, not because he wanted to make life easier on the Germans, but because he understood something a lot of angrier, more impulsive men in that camp didn't yet grasp. A camp that looked chaotic from the guard towers was a camp the Germans would crack down on harder. Order, paradoxically, protected the prisoners more than defiance did, at least for now. He organized what the men called Provisional Wing X, giving the camp's population a formal military structure, chains of command, discipline standards, even while every man in it remained, on paper, a captive with no rights beyond the Geneva Conventions and German goodwill provided. At the same time, he began the slower, harder work of dealing directly with the camp commandant and his staff, pushing in German for better food distribution, for medical attention, for the small, grinding improvements that made the difference between a bearable winter and one that killed men slowly through neglect. This is where the story could easily slide into something too simple, a POW hero single-handedly transforming a prison camp through force of will. That's not quite what the record supports, and it's worth saying plainly. Conditions at Stalag Luft I remained hard for the entire winter of 1944 into 1945. Zemke did not fix the camp. Nobody could have. What he did was establish, gradually, a working relationship with German camp officials, the kind of relationship where requests got heard, where small negotiated improvements accumulated, where the Germans running the camp began, in small ways, to treat him less like a name on a prisoner roster and more like someone worth actually listening to. That relationship was fragile. It rested on nothing but Zemke's judgment, his fluency, and whatever residual respect that train strafing incident had earned him among the German personnel who'd witnessed it. And it was about to be tested by something neither side could control: the collapse of the war around them. By the early months of 1945, the map of Europe was changing faster than anyone inside Stalag Luft I could keep pace with. In the west, Allied armies were pushing across the Rhine into the German heartland. In the east, the Red Army was advancing with a speed and ferocity that terrified everyone in its path, German civilians most of all, given the accounts already spreading of how Soviet forces were treating German territory as they moved through it. Stalag Luft I sat on the Baltic coast, which meant it was directly in the path of the eastern advance. The Soviets were coming, and every week they were coming closer. For the prisoners, this created a strange, uncomfortable kind of hope. Liberation was coming. Everyone could feel it. But liberation by which army and under what circumstances was a question that kept getting more urgent and more unclear. For the Germans running the camp, the calculation was different and far darker. As the war visibly collapsed around them, German officials at camps across the country faced an impossible set of choices with no good options anywhere inside them. Some camps were evacuated westward on forced marches, prisoners driven on foot for weeks through brutal winter conditions, away from the advancing Soviets and toward Allied lines. Marches that killed men through exhaustion, cold, and starvation, even as liberation drew closer with every mile. Zemke had almost certainly heard reports of these marches from other camps, even if the details reaching Stalag Luft I were incomplete, and he understood with total clarity what a forced march out of Barth would mean for 9,000 men. By this point in the war, further transfers and consolidations had swelled the camp's population well past the 7,000 who'd been there when he arrived. Many of them already weakened by months or years of insufficient food in the dead of a Baltic winter, driven west on foot ahead of an army neither side wanted them to fall into the hands of for reasons that had far more to do with politics than with the prisoners' own safety. A march like that could kill a significant fraction of the camp before it ever reached safety. This is the moment the ticking clock in this story becomes impossible to ignore, and it's worth sitting with directly rather than rushing past. Zemke wasn't racing to escape. He wasn't racing to win a battle. He was racing against a decision that German high command might make at any point, a decision that once made, 9,000 exhausted, malnourished men would have almost no ability to resist. Every conversation he had with the commandant from this point forward carried that weight underneath it, whether either man said it aloud or not. And as it turned out, the commandant at Stalag Luft I, an officer identified in the records as Colonel Warnstedt, was facing pressures of his own that Zemke would come to understand and eventually use. Here's what makes this stretch of the story different from most POW accounts you'll find from the Second World War, and it's worth pausing on directly because it's the heart of everything that follows. By the spring of 1945, both sides of the negotiating table at Stalag Luft I knew, privately, that Germany had already lost. The German officers running that camp were not fanatics clinging to a doomed ideology past all reason, or at least the ones Zemke found himself actually negotiating with were not. They were professional military men who could read a map as well as anyone, who understood that the Reich they'd served for years was weeks, possibly days from ending. Their personal futures, and increasingly their personal safety, depended far more on how the war's final chapter played out than on any order still coming down from Berlin. This gave Zemke something almost no prisoner in the history of that war had: leverage that didn't come from strength, but from the fact that his captors needed something from him almost as badly as he needed something from them. What did they need? Cover. A version of events once the war ended that painted them as reasonable men who'd protected the prisoners in their charge rather than brutalized them. Zemke understood this, and he used it, not through threats, but through the same steady, direct German-language conversations he'd been having for months. If this is the part of the story that surprises you, a prisoner and his captors quietly working toward the same outcome in the war's final weeks, you're not alone. It surprised the men living through it, too. And if stories like this are the reason you're still watching, this is exactly the kind of history this channel was built to dig up. So if you haven't already, now's a good moment to subscribe. The specifics of the arrangement that eventually took shape were not settled in one conversation. They were built slowly, across weeks, through a series of exchanges between Zemke and Warnstedt's staff, conversations that had to account for a dozen different ways the situation could still go catastrophically wrong. SS units were still active in the region, and SS officers were not known for honoring the kind of quiet accommodations regular Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe officers might privately be willing to make. If SS command got wind of Warnstedt's camp preparing to simply hand itself over to the prisoners, the consequences for the German officers involved could be severe, potentially fatal. There was also the guard force itself to consider. Not every German soldier at Stalag Luft I shared Warnstedt's calculation. Some guards had spent years enforcing discipline on these prisoners, sometimes brutally, and had every reason to fear what might happen if 9,000 angry, starving Allied airmen were suddenly given free rein with those same guards still standing in front of them. And there was the matter of the Soviets, closing in from the east, whose intentions towards captured German military personnel and towards the camp itself were entirely unknown. Zemke had to thread all of this, not just negotiate an end to his own captivity, but manage an outcome that kept 9,000 men alive, kept the handover from becoming a bloodbath, and gave both sides a version of events they could each live with once the shooting finally stopped. By April of 1945, the arrangement Zemke and the camp's German command were quietly working toward had taken a clear shape. The Germans would withdraw from Stalag Luft I before Soviet forces arrived, departing quietly, at night, taking only small arms with them, avoiding any confrontation with either the prisoners or the approaching Red Army. In exchange, the handover would happen without incident. No violence, no last-minute reprisals against the guards on their way out the door, no chaos that could be blamed on either side. It's worth being honest here about how remarkable and how fragile this actually was. This was not a formal surrender negotiated between recognized military authorities. It was an informal, deeply unofficial understanding between a prison camp's command staff and the senior officer among their own prisoners, built entirely on trust that had accumulated, conversation by conversation, over 4 months of Zemke managing that relationship with total deliberateness. There was no guarantee it would hold. Right up until the moment it actually happened, there was no guarantee any part of it would hold. Zemke's own staff, the officers who'd helped him run Provisional Wing X through the winter, knew the broad shape of what was being negotiated. But Zemke made a specific, deliberate choice about how much the wider camp population would be told and when. He kept the details of the German departure secret from most of the camp until after it had already happened. This wasn't about withholding hope for his own men, it was about control. 9,000 exhausted, furious prisoners, many of whom had spent years enduring German guards who had, in some cases, treated them with real cruelty, were not a population Zemke could guarantee would respond calmly to the news that their captors were simply leaving. Some of those guards had made enemies inside that wire. If word got out too early that the Germans were preparing to walk away unarmed and unescorted, there was a real risk that some prisoners would try to settle scores before the handover was complete. Scores that could turn a peaceful transition into exactly the kind of violence Zemke had spent months trying to prevent. So the plan stayed contained. A small circle of senior officers, careful timing, and a German command staff that had to trust, with everything on the line, including their own lives, that an American colonel they'd been quietly negotiating with for months would actually hold up his end of an agreement that existed nowhere on paper, sealed but nothing but conversation. By now, the men inside Stalag Luft I had spent nearly 5 months living under Zemke's careful, exhausting management of a situation none of them could see the full shape of. Most of them didn't know how close the end actually was. In the final days of April 1945, the sound of artillery fire had become audible from the camp. A constant, low rumble to the east that everyone understood meant the Soviets were no longer weeks away, but days, and then hours. The German departure, when it finally came, happened exactly the way it had been planned. Under cover of darkness, the guards and camp staff withdrew from Stalag Luft I, carrying only small arms, leaving the towers and the wire and the barracks behind them. No confrontation, no violence, no last acts of cruelty on the way out the door. They simply left. The morning of May 1st, 1945, the prisoners of Stalag Luft I woke up to find the watchtowers empty. Somewhere inside the camp, someone had been preparing for exactly this moment, because within hours a flag went up the pole where the swastika had flown for years. It hadn't come from anywhere official. It had been hand-sewn by prisoners, using whatever scraps of fabric they'd managed to accumulate, stitched together into a version of the Stars and Stripes good enough to mean everything to the men standing underneath it. The Red Army arrived the following day. And this is the part of the story that answers the question this whole episode opened with. Because when the Soviets reached Stalag Luft I, what they found was not a camp in chaos, not a riot, not a massacre in either direction, but 9,000 Allied prisoners, organized, disciplined, and already under the command of one of their own officers, who had spent 5 months building exactly the kind of order that made this outcome possible. Getting the Germans to leave peacefully had been the first negotiation. What came next was, in some ways, harder. The Soviets who arrived at Stalag Luft I were not liberating allies in the simple sense the word suggests. They were an occupying force moving through conquered territory with their own priorities, their own chain of command, and, as it became clear fairly quickly, their own intentions for what should happen to the liberated Allied prisoners, intentions that didn't necessarily line up with getting those prisoners home quickly. Zemke once again found himself the man in the middle, this time speaking not German, but drawing on the months he'd spent in the Soviet Union years earlier, before the war, training Soviet pilots to fly American aircraft under the Lend-Lease program. He had some working knowledge of Russian and, more importantly, some understanding of how Soviet military bureaucracy actually functioned, knowledge that put him in a position almost no one else in that camp occupied. The Soviets, in the war's chaotic final weeks, were not in any particular hurry to release 9,000 Allied airmen back to American and British control. Some Soviet commanders in the field seemed to view liberated POWs as leverage, or simply as a logistics problem to be dealt with on Moscow's timeline rather than Washington's. Zemke pushed back on this, too. The same patient, direct approach he'd used on the German commandant, now redirected at an entirely different set of captors who happened to be technically on his own side. He worked to convince Soviet officers in the field that these men needed to be moved to American-held territory quickly, rather than held indefinitely while larger questions about prisoner exchange got sorted out at a level far above any single camp. It took time. It took the same kind of grinding, conversation by conversation pressure that had gotten the Germans to leave peacefully in the first place. But eventually, arrangements were made to fly the men of Stalag Luft 1 out to Allied-controlled territory, rather than leaving them to make their own way west through a landscape still full of danger. By the time the last of the camp's prisoners had been evacuated, Hub Zemke had negotiated, in effect, two separate withdrawals from two separate armies, one German, one Soviet, without a single documented act of large-scale violence against the men in his charge. It would be easy to end this story here, on the flag going up and the guards walking away into the dark. It's the moment that answers the question. But it isn't quite the whole truth, and this channel doesn't tell half a story just because the other half is less triumphant. Zemke didn't go home when the camp was liberated. He stayed in Europe, searching for other missing American prisoners of war who hadn't had a Hub Zemke in their own camp, men whose stories didn't end with a hand-sewn flag, but with silence or worse. That work continued for months after most of his own men had already gone home to families who'd spent years not knowing if they'd see them again. He went on to a long career in the Air Force, leadership roles, staff positions, eventually the presidency of the Air War College. By most measures, it was a distinguished continuation of an already distinguished life. But it's worth being honest about something else, too, because the record doesn't smooth this over, and neither should we. Some later accounts suggest that Zemke's post-war career, and his path to becoming a general officer, was affected by decisions and controversies stemming from his time in Europe after the war ended, the specifics of which fall outside verified detail for this episode, and rather than speculate, we simply flag that the story of Hub Zemke doesn't end tidily just because Barth did. What we can say with full confidence is this. In the final chaotic months of a war that had already cost the world more than anyone could fully measure, one prisoner, a man with no rank that meant anything behind that wire, no weapon, and nothing but a fluent grasp of his captor's own language, and a reputation built one difficult decision at a time, managed to walk 9,000 men through the most dangerous stretch of their captivity without losing them to a forced march, a massacre, or a Soviet holding pattern that could have swallowed them for months. The German officers who ran that camp didn't hand it over because they respected the Geneva Conventions, or because they'd suddenly discovered kindness in the war's final weeks. They handed it over because over 5 months, an American colonel had proven himself to be the one person in that entire situation they could actually trust to keep his word. That's not a small thing to have earned from the men holding you prisoner. It might be the rarest thing anyone earned in that whole war. None of this made sense to the exhausted men who woke up on the 1st of May and found the towers empty. Not at first. They only knew that the flag going up meant it was finally, actually over. 6 months before that flag went up, Hub Zemke was a man with nothing. A parachute over enemy territory, injuries he couldn't treat, and a war that had already decided on paper exactly what his life was worth. One prisoner, one number, one name in a file. By the time it ended, the men who'd held that file were the ones who left quietly in the night, trusting him to hold up his end of an agreement that existed nowhere but in his word. That's the story this channel exists to tell. Not the generals everyone already knows, but the ones who did something remarkable without ever firing another shot. If you believe stories like Hub Zemke's deserve to be remembered, subscribe. That's the whole reason this channel exists.